and she was president of Spanish Academy of Art and Cinematographic Sciences between 2006 and 2009, at which date she was appointed as Minister of Culture. She brought not only the elegance of her country, but also the knowledge, her personal knowledge on this subject. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Sinde.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction. Hello, good morning to everyone. And I want to thank Mark Donfried for having invited me to this event and having this opportunity to share this table with such brilliant personalities of the international academia and cultural life and political world. It's very impressive to be among this list. It's something I'd never imagined. And I think it's really important to be among people who are committed to the renovation of progressive thinking, and more importantly, committed to improve the living conditions of our fellow citizens through culture. This is my first time here, so I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about myself. Like it was just said, I am not really a politician. I happen to be a politician for 3 years. I'm not either a scholar or an expert in the field of cultural diplomacy. I'm more of an artist. I am a filmmaker by trade, and I have directed 3 films, and I have written. I'm mostly a screenwriter. I've written some 15 features, many hours of television. I'm also a writer. I write books for children and some plays. So that's my background. And in 2006, I was, some of my colleagues in the film industry, a group of directors and producers who are friends, suggested to me that I ran for president of the Academy of Motion Pictures in Spain, which is a big institution. It's bigger than it actually is in size. It's because it gives these annual awards, these cinema awards that are called Goya, after the painter, and they're very popular. They are watched in television by very many people, and they really make a difference in the lack of those films that get these awards. So it's a very successful institution. It's an association of filmmakers, and you get their actors, directors, and art directors, or editors, everybody in the business. It's a member once they have enough experience. So you get invited to very many events. And at the time when I was president, a new cinema law was being passed and was being discussed. So as president, you also get to participate or get to share your view in the parliament and in meetings in the presidential palace and so on. So I got acquainted from 2006 to 2009, because I was president of this Academia of Cinema, with the vice president, Teresa Fernandez de la Vega, and her staff, and also I went to parliament, and and I met President Zapatero on several occasions, the socialist president for the past 8 years, up until December of last year, when the new conservative government took power. So in 2009, I was working on this script in April, and I got this very, very, very strange phone call from the president's cabinet offering me to be Minister of Culture. Of course, I didn't understand at first what they were talking about, but after a while, well, I accepted. And that's how I became a Minister of Culture, not because I had pursued a political career, but because I guess because I was a professional, a person from the culture, a real professional who had some institutional experience and maybe some advocation. And so anyway, I was a Minister of Culture for almost 3 years, from 2009 up to December 22nd, and I thank again the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy for offering me this opportunity almost 12 months later to look back at that experience. And I might be critical of my work, and I might be critical of some of the works that politicians do, and I apologize for that, but I think what's interesting is to have someone who's been on both sides of cultural diplomacy. And again, after, this is probably my first time that I'm speaking publicly about my experience, and it's good that it's in Berlin and it's not in Spain, because I don't want to be protagonist of any controversy in the press anymore. I had a very, very harsh time when I was a minister because of all kinds of things, mainly related to internet regulation. And so I don't want to go back to any of that, but I will be honest with you, and I hope some of my ideas are useful. Anyway, as you all know, and that's something that I wanted briefly to state here, cultural diplomacy is not a new concept. It's something that it was always existed since the very, very first days of the oldest civilization. In fact, I will just point to you something that I very much like. It's this, and that's why I gave this very odd title to my lecture, but there's this sculpture in the Altes Museum where all the Egyptian collection is here in Berlin. There's this beautiful sculpture of a scribe, and he is sitting cross-legged, and he or she, maybe because this is such a beautiful person and so calm in his looks that we don't know whether it's a man or a woman. I like to imagine that it could be a woman too. This scribe sits cross-legged, and this is what the actual sign but the scribe says. It says, "The scribe sits cross-legged on the floor with his papyrus scroll open in his lap. He is one of the elite members of ancient Egyptian society. Historic personalities who have made a name for themselves by their cultural achievements as poets, architects, and artists are still venerated centuries on in the form of scribe figures which are publicly displayed at temple gates. They are the representatives of Egyptian history in the public consciousness. Whereas the standing or strident figure and the seated figure hyperbolize the earthly existence of man to a state of everlasting eternity, the scribe figure testifies to the historically unique life story and is effectively a profession of belief in the human individual." So I was very moved when I saw this recollection of how important people in culture and their work has been ever since, thousands of years ago. And I think it's very clear to all of you how sometimes culture, or up until probably the 20th century, has always been linked to power, to government, in very many different words, to colonization, to the spread of new ideas. In Spain, we are today, I can very easily talk with my colleague from Honduras because we both share the same language and very many values that are shared, because kings and queens of Spain colonized Latin America with our culture, with our values, with our language. And so that's something that is very obvious. I also would like to make a brief, point out briefly how in the 20th century, the United States and Europe took different paths. They diverged in the way they would act with their cultural diplomacy. And Europe took more the way of the minister André Malraux. It was protective of the culture with public financing and so forth, while in the United States it was more of a political environment that allowed the industries to flourish, and it still is today a very, very well protected and very well defended industry, such as film. And I think many Europeans have a wrong idea about the rules and laws of culture in the States, and particularly about cinema. And I think that ever since the beginning of the 20th century, American presidents were very, very much aware that cinema gave them the opportunity to have this locomotive that would really pull other products into other markets, and they would spread out their ideas, their values, and of course also, you know, their genes or their music or their literature. And so they've been very, very successfully protective of this cultural product called cinema. And while Europeans, we have been, even though film was invented here, and we had the biggest studios of silent films were in Europe, Pathé and Nordisk were the biggest companies, were major companies. They lost their place when the technological transformation from silent film to talkies, to films with sound, took place, and the Americans really control the market ever since. So that's something that I would suggest mostly to students to look at now, because it's very, it can be compared to what's happening today with the technological transition from analogic to digital. It's also a time of major change, and in changes there's opportunities, but there's also a lot of people that are left behind, and I think that's something that will come up in these next days here in your talks, as I have seen that in the agenda, and I think it's a very interesting subject, who gets lost and who gets behind with the digital transition. So what I really want to tell you is the difficulties that I found, that I encountered when I became minister. I thought that all this that I've told you about, it was very obvious, how useful culture is to spread your the image of your country, how you can, you know, when the Spanish soccer team wins the World Cup, how you can get more tourism, and you can more easily, or you have the Olympics in Barcelona, how that really meant a boost, gigantic boost for Barcelona as a touristic destination, or and then also for some Barcelona designers or industries or gastronomy and so forth, how cultural success internationally for a country really means that that country has opportunities in other fields, in economic fields. So I thought this was something that it was obvious and it was well known, but it was not. And the truth is that you cannot love what you don't know, and yet you can very well despise and hate what you ignore. So all this that seemed evident to me, the importance of culture, when I became minister, I realized that was not at all clear to other members of the cabinet. Even though, according to statistics, the cultural sector in Spain is responsible for up to 4% of the gross domestic product, and up to 800,000 people have jobs related to creative industries, traditionally it is believed to be no more than luxurious decoration for the rich or entertainment for the masses. In many people's view, culture had nothing to do with real life, had nothing to do with serious matters, with economics. And artists and creators, most of the time, were just opinionated troublemakers for those in government. This might seem old-fashioned, but yet it's really the general attitude that I've always found, that culture is something minor. So my first job was to prove to other ministers, to other politicians, to colleagues who had way more power than myself, either because they were closer to the president or because they held high positions in the Socialist Party hierarchy or the administration, that culture is not a mere ornament. And it seems to me that it's best to try to prove and convince rather than being confrontational, and particularly when you have no strength whatsoever. And ministers of culture traditionally have very little weight. We are light feather fighters. But I had no problem in explaining once and again why investing in culture, creativity, and knowledge could be crucial, particularly in a time of deep economic crisis. Receptive to my message and willing to collaborate was the Minister of Industry and Tourism, because Spain is a country that has most of its internal revenues from tourism, and yet the tourism, what it's called sun and beach, is ripe There's no more beaches that we can exploit. There's no more hotels we can build, although some try to build hotels in very odd places, destroying the coast and so forth. Anyway, he really believed in cultural tourism. He really believed that it's not seasonal and that it attracts tourists who have a higher capacity of spending money, and that it would spread into the inland, not just the coast. So, and after all, you know, many centuries ago, we opened the road to Santiago de Compostela, the road of St. James, which was one of the very first paths of cultural tourism in the world, with thousands of pilgrims even today, more every year, either walk or by bike, cross all the north of Spain up to the tomb of the Apostle St. James. And so we had some experience, successful experience with that. So, like the mayor of the city of Toledo told me once, this is a very bright, brilliant man, and he said, culture is our factory here in Toledo. We have no factories, no industry anymore. So we all live because of culture, because of El Greco paintings, and because of the synagogues and the palaces and the cathedrals and the heritage that Toledo has. And I really like that concept, that culture can be the factory, the new factories of Europe, once factories have gone to Asia and to other continents where they are much more competitive. So old culture, heritage was interesting to my fellow Minister of Tourism, but I thought, what about culture of the present, and what about culture of the future? How does that work? How are we going to generate new heritage or new literature, new film, new dance, new music, new theater? How do we go about that if we only think about the past and protecting that past? So it was very clear to me that I also, as Minister of Culture, I had an obligation to contribute to my country and how to really solve the crisis or come out of the economic crisis. And I really believe that culture could help out very much. So it's crucial to me to really transmit to other politicians that what they thought would always be there would always be painters, and there would always be cinematographers, and there would always be orchestras, and there would always be dancers. It's not that way. There's many countries that have lost their cinematography or that have no cinema whatsoever, and they cannot communicate their experiences of lives and their views of lives because they just don't have the means, not because they lack the talent. It's a matter of means. So I really had to convey that it's fragile, that culture is fragile, and that culture really is born in the intimacy of the ateliers where painters paint, or where people devise their novels, or where people think about the plays they're going to write, or where they perform, or where they rehearse their violin, which takes very, very many years and a great investment of a whole family to raise a good violin player. So I really, it was fundamental for me, for them to understand that it really needs a soil for these seeds to grow and to bloom, and that it's not something that happens just because people have this uncontrollable desire to paint, or this uncontrollable desire. After all, Goya or Velázquez or any of those great composers or painters of the past or architects, they worked on commission. There was somebody who commissioned that work, and there was somebody who financed it. So it was also important to me to prove that we can generate employment, that there's a lot of employment, that it's really generated by culture, and particularly in Europe. And so we worked very much to be on the government statistics that we were not a part of, so we could be quantified. Many people in culture see this with suspicion because they think art should not be quantified. And I understand that, because I will warn you later about the dangers of some of these cultural policies. But on the same hand, I realized that you have to speak their language. So I tried to translate everything that I knew about the opportunities of culture historically into the language of economics in order to win some of their confidence and to make them understand, and so they would not be indifferent. We generated this concept, we used a lot this concept, which is cultural industries, cultural and creative industries. And yet, there was a lot that we could do, because all areas of human activity have to do with culture. So, of course, I had a lot to share and a lot to collaborate with the other ministers, ministers of culture, of education, of science and technology, of social affairs, of industry, of public construction, work, finance, justice, and of course, foreign affairs. And so foreign affairs, what's interesting, I don't know about other governments in other countries, but in Spain, when I arrived at the ministry, there was a huge fight between culture and foreign affairs. Because the thing is, they are not coordinated, and there was a huge struggle over the control of cultural activities overseas in other countries. And there was a lot of turmoil among the ministers, and also there was great resistance from diplomats and civil servants who did not want to give up the little power they had in the countries where they were working. And they did not want culture to be in charge of the culture activities abroad. So we worked on this document and we signed this peace agreement that it's called PACE, Plan de Acción Cultural Exterior. And from then on, we had meetings, everybody, because the Minister of Foreign Affairs actually has this agency that it's much more powerful than the actual Ministry of Culture, and it has even more money, and they have all these activities in Latin America, and they have many cultural buildings in Montevideo, in Mexico, in Buenos Aires, in Brazil, in several cities, and in many other, even in Havana, we had one that was closed by Fidel because it was too, well, because they do work, because these cultural centers are very active, and in some countries they become the center of very avant-garde maybe movements and places where artists can go and they can show their work, and so sometimes they can be uncomfortable, just like during the dictatorship in Spain, institutions like the Goethe Institute or the French Institute or the British Council were really important in generating, in bringing into a country with dictatorship, such as Franco's dictatorship was, bringing information and bringing also views and being critical.
Perhaps round up and come to an end with a short closing remarks?
And so I just wanted to really share with you that there's just as much as cultural diplomacy is important, there's some dangers to it that we must be careful about, and one is the danger of transforming and erasing other cultures, how digitalization sometimes is not compatible with traditional cultures that are oral cultures or other cultures, and also how we can banalize culture, and we can really be contributing to helping big companies like Amazon, Apple, Google, and those who, the makers of our telephones and our computers and our laptops, we can make them into the real actors in the culture, international culture scene, and that's, I don't think, is the way to go, because there's many artists that are much more vulnerable in countries that do not have access to the forums where legislation, international legislation is debated, that need our support, and that's a field that I think cultural diplomacy should worry about. And also the dangers of institutional culture, how oftentimes politicians, whether we want it or not, we are pushed to, you know, have our photograph taken with artists and generate cultural events that are very popular, so we are popular too, and that really does not help to the credibility of artists and culture, and they become wary of institutional culture, and that's not very democratic, I think, because ethics should be really the origin of any cultural diplomacy. And it really should be about the search for common good, and it should be, and I think it's a way, a very useful way, a very useful mean to also fight poverty and violence and inequality, because people really do change their minds about, I don't know, utopia after they've read El Quijote, or you change your views on wars and bombing after you've seen the Guernica painting by Picasso.